Welcome back. A brief but heavy story arc when policy hunger and misunderstanding collide. History shifts. Which angle should we dig into? Primary documents, key figures, or the places themselves? Type it in the comments. Winter came hard to the northern plains. Circles of dancers turned in the snow, singing for a world made right. December 1890. Pine Ridge Agency, Dakota Territory. Across Standing Rock, Cheyenne River, Rosebud, and Pine Ridge, the Lakota Oglala Miniconjou. Hunkpapa and Brule gathered at open flats and along creek bottoms under thin rations and closer supervision. Officials called it the Ghost Dance. Families called it a ceremony of hope and reunion. The ground was frozen. The wires were busy. The stakes were human and immediate. The setting spans 2 seasons and 4 agencies. Early 1889, Nevada carried a message outward through visiting delegations and kin networks. By late 1890, Dakota Territory held the largest concentration of dancers on the plains. Agency agents, interpreters, and police watched the circles and filed daily reports. Nearby army posts moved patrols closer to reservation roads. School rules tightened. Survey crews marked allotment lines. Hunger pressed families toward the agency storehouses and toward one another. The principal actors are clear. Lakota communities organized by camp and band kept ceremony and kin at the center while weighing risk. The Office of Indian Affairs managed annuities, schools, and police. Department commanders stood ready to support civil authority. Messengers and telegraph clerks moved the phrases that would frame policy. Each day's decisions were recorded on paper while the circles continued on open ground. This film asks a narrow question with wide consequences. When did the Ghost Dance surge across the Lakota agencies, and why did its speed and scale decide the outcome of the winter of 1890? The answer will be found in dates, routes, and orders. It will measure the pace of a religious movement against the pace of an administrative system and show how a sequence of calm decisions taken under pressure converged on one cold month that still shapes memory today. Spring 1889 set the prelude. In Nevada, a Paiute teacher named Wovoka announced a way to restore balance through right living and a great circle dance. The date fixed by a solar eclipse early that year became an anchor in oral accounts and letters. Through summer delegations and work crews carried the songs north and east along rail lines and wagon roads. By autumn, the message had reached kin networks on the northern plains. The ground was ready before the snows returned. The deep structure was older. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 promised a large Lakota homeland and rations during transition. The 1877 agreement following the Black Hills crisis shrank rights and opened the door to mineral wealth extraction. Rail surveys pressed west. Homestead filings and grazing leases followed survey stakes. By the late 1880s, the buffalo economy was gone and cash markets were thin. Households depended on agency issue days and small crop plots. Each cut to beef contracts and flour allotments altered daily life. Policy had shifted from war to administration. The Army withdrew from direct control but remained within reach at frontier posts. The Office of Indian Affairs set rules for residence work and schooling. In 1883, the Courts of Indian Offenses defined punishments for ceremonies the state disapproved. On reservation and off-reservation, schools expanded in this period. Children were moved by wagon or train according to season and head counts. English lessons and uniform drills filled the days. Families learned to measure distance by train schedules and agency bells. The Sioux Act of 1889 broke the Great Sioux Reservation into several jurisdictions. Pine Ridge, Rosebud, Cheyenne River, Standing Rock, and others were defined in statute and on maps. With division came allotment surveys and the promise of individual land titles. With division also came thinner rations. Appropriations were negotiated yearly. In 1890, drought and crop failure struck hard. Agency herds were not sufficient to fill the gap. The ration line grew long and resentful. Reports from agents described need and idleness in the same sentence. Those sentences guided policy more than the winter wind. Immediate triggers followed the structure. In early 1890, teachers and messengers began to share the new dance with Lakota communities. The rite called for moral discipline and peace. Circles formed on flats near creeks and on tablelands away from the agency proper. As participation grew, some agents filed warnings. They asked for authority to arrest leaders and to disarm those they viewed as dangerous. Word moved by telegraph from agency offices to department desks. The speed of copper wire created its own momentum. By July 1890, crop failure reports crossed the Missouri. Some gardens survived near agency irrigation ditches. Most did not. Beef issues were reduced by contract shortfalls. Flour shipments lagged. Families stretched stores by hunting rabbits and deer near the timber. Children wore out shoes on the road to the schoolhouse. Elders measured the season by the time between issue days. Into this shortage came a ceremony that promised reunion and renewal. Participation rose with need. Through August and September 1890, visiting teachers such as Kicking Bear and Short Bull moved between camps. They adjusted songs to local rhythms and spoke about a coming change if people held to the path. Many Lakota understood the dance as a covenant of patience. Some also adopted shirts marked with symbolic power. Agents saw crowds in unusual garments and read threat. The difference in reading widened as nights grew longer. Objectives diverged. For Lakota households, the immediate aim was survival with dignity. Keep children fed, keep kin together, keep ceremony alive under new rule. For many who danced the circle was not a prelude to arms, but an answer to despair. The objective was endurance. The constraint was material. Rations and winter stores were limited. Ammunition and horses were limited. Roads to markets were controlled by permits and patrols. The logistics of a camp were wagons, blankets, kettles, and dried meat. Every mile cost strength. For the Office of Indian Affairs and its agents, the objective was order as they defined it. Maintain attendance at school, advance allotment, prevent gatherings that could become violent. For nearby Army commands, the objective was support to civil authority on request. Move companies by rail when signaled, establish camps near agency boundaries, demonstrate presence. Their constraints were also real. Winter transport was slow. Forage was scarce. Units arrived with set ammunition loads and ration wagons. Telegraph lines brought orders fast, but the last miles still belonged to couriers in the dark. By October 1890, the pattern became a curve. Dances increased near Pine Ridge and Rosebud. Reports from Standing Rock and Cheyenne River noted circles after first frost. Agents demanded guidance and reinforcements. Supervisors urged caution in public and firmness in private. Some recommended arrest of named teachers. Others asked for emergency rations to diffuse tension. The balance tilted with each wire sent. Early November 1890 fixed the start of the surge. Fields were bare. Issue days were thin. Circles grew on open ground. At Pine Ridge, a new agent signaled alarm and asked for troops. At Standing Rock, discussions about arresting Sitting Bull moved from rumor to draft orders. South on the Cheyenne River, families weighed whether to stay near the agency or join kin at Pine Ridge for safety in numbers. North winds cut through canvas and cotton. Each household counted flour and listened for hooves on frozen roads. Logistics snapshots show the asymmetry and the risk. Families on the move carried children, elders, kettles, robes, and a few rifles. They followed creek bottoms and shelter belts and stopped where wood and water could be found. Army detachments arrived by rail to division posts and marched with wagons to the reservation lines. They relied on depot beef and hay yards along the route. The agency sat between the two flows like a gate. Papers moved faster than people. That speed would decide much of what followed. Late October 1890 opened with hard frost at Pine Ridge. On open flats south of the agency, Oglala camps gathered under a pale sky, smoke from cook fires lying flat in the wind. Circles formed after noon and held through dusk. Riders came in from Porcupine and the Badlands Edge, tying horses to picket lines and laying out robes for elders. The ground here was chosen for space and sight lines away from the agency buildings, yet near enough for families to reach rations if issued. At the agency office, the new agent measured the crowd by the number of shadows on the snow and counted risk. Telegraph keys clacked in the evening, the language spare and urgent. Interpreters rode the short miles between the dance ground and the office, carrying messages that changed shape with each retelling. The delay was not in distance, but in trust. Families sang. The wires trembled. Soldiers at nearby posts waited for orders that might arrive at any hour of the night. North at Standing Rock, the Hunkpapa community held to winter routines along the Grand River as the first fine snow dusted the river breaks. In cabins and teepees around Sitting Bull's household, visitors warmed Diwan over stoves and repeated what they had heard from travelers who had returned from the south. Some had visited Pine Ridge in summer and seen wider circles there. Others had stood in gatherings nearer home. The ceremony as practiced in these camps kept the terms of moral discipline and patience. The pressure came from outside in reports that the agent considered arrests. Messengers took the road between the agency and the outlying settlements, their ponies blowing steam in the cold. Each ride consumed daylight that winter did not spare. Each conversation hinged on carefully chosen words, Lakota to English to Lakota again, with meanings shaved thin by worry. At Rosebud in early November, circles led by Brule teachers gathered near Black Pipe Flats when the weather held, then shifted to sheltered draws when wind cut across the grass. The agency's ration house was quieter now, that beef issues had been reduced, but the store of flour remained a magnet and a measure. In the evening, songs carried down the creek bottoms, and adults kept children close to the fire. Agents noted the number of lodges and asked the Indian police for lists of attendees. The police complied as best they could and walked a line between civil orders and kin obligations. The reports traveled by wire to superiors, whose replies were sometimes cautious on paper and urgent by telephone voice relayed over short distances and remembered in long ones. The result was confusion and a lean toward force. The Cheyenne River Agency lay west of the Missouri along a river that froze early that year. Many Conjou camps set lodges where water and wood were close. Short Bull and other visiting teachers came through in November and early December, staying a few days in each place. Dances rose in the afternoon, sometimes under a pale sun, often under stars. News arrived a day or two behind the weather. When families heard that Pine Ridge had asked for troops, they packed quietly for shorter moves, keeping routes within the cover of cottonwoods and breaks. The agency office sent and received telegrams that turned local practice into distant alarm. Between a wire sent at dusk and an order received at dawn, a whole community could move 10 miles and become invisible in a white world. Mid-November fixed the first sharp point. At Pine Ridge, the agent sent an urgent telegram describing crowds and a lack of protection for employees and government property. The phrasing, vivid and fearful, traveled well. In Washington and at department headquarters, it read like the preface to a crisis. On the ground, it hardened attitudes. Patrols from nearby posts came closer, not yet into the dance grounds, but close enough that riders on the ridge could count horse heads and guess the number of carbines. Families who had planned to visit relatives north toward White Clay kept children inside and watched the road. The dance circles did not stop. They shifted to flats farther from the agency and tightened their perimeter. Indians are dancing in the snow and are wild and crazy. The employees and government property at this agency have no protection and are at the mercy of these dancers. Why delay by further investigation? We need protection, and we need it now. Royer Telegram, Pine Ridge Agency, 11890 to 1115. The immediate effects radiated outward. At Standing Rock, the agent weighed options and turned more of the problem over to the agency police, whose ranks included men respected in the community, and thus exposed to blame on both sides. Rumor compressed time. One morning's talk of a future arrest became by evening the report that soldiers were already on the way. In households around Sitting Bull, women packed extra clothing into parfleeches and men checked lariats and saddles. Some families decided to remain near the agency under watch, reasoning that proximity meant predictability. Others planned to ride south toward Cheyenne River and then Pine Ridge, trusting kinship ties and the shelter of numbers. Snow deepened in the last week of November, and the wind turned steady from the northwest. Telegraph lines sang in the cold as wire expanded and contracted, and line crews knocked rime from insulators with poles. Messages went through, but not always on the first try and not always in full. Agents adjusted content to fit a line that dropped without warning. A missing phrase could look like a change of meaning. At the far end, a caution altered into a demand. Couriers carried paper duplicates when the wire failed, losing a day at least on the round trip. That day mattered. It meant a circle could rise and disperse before an order to halt arrived, offering proof to some that the dance was slippery and organized, and proof to others that the officials did not see what they judged. Early December brought the second set of incidents in close succession. Soldiers detrained at division posts and marched toward Pine Ridge along frozen section roads. Their wagons creaked, wheels chained for traction mules blowing in the cold. Families at outlying Oglala camps saw dust and knew what it meant even in winter. Some came into the agency to ask for reassurance. Others moved away toward Stronghold Table, where the land itself formed a wall. At Rosebud, the Brûlé circles continued in smaller groups, each camp watching the horizon for mounted patrols. At Cheyenne River, many Conjou headmen argued the timing of a southward move to join relatives near Pine Ridge. The choice set risk against risk. Travel exposed the young and old to cold. Staying exposed them to arrest if orders shifted overnight. At Standing Rock, the third incident gathered its own momentum. Through the first half of December, papers moved across the agent's desk concerning the arrest of Sitting Bull for questioning. The case for the arrest rested on warnings about influence rather than acts. The instrument chosen was the agency policemen who knew the household and the ground. Word of the plan leaked in fragments, some of it carried by people who misunderstood on purpose, some by those who misunderstood because they feared. The household's allies prepared for a dawn call. The agent's office prepared a report template. The Army stood outwardly aside with inward readiness. By the second week of December, the line of escalation was plain on a map. At Pine Ridge, patrols were now visible from the agency road. At Rosebud, the circles were smaller but stubborn. At Cheyenne River, more families loaded travois and wagons and turned south. At Standing Rock, The arrest plan waited on a day and an hour. The weather was brutal now, the kind that makes choices final. All this was communication in slow motion, a contest between the speed of wire and the speed of winter travel. The dance circles had grown not because of a single speech or a single promise, but because hunger and hope met in a ceremony that could be learned in an afternoon and held through a long night. The state's reply, braided from telegrams and orders, came on a different clock. The two clocks were now close enough to collide. The campaign opened along two lines in December 1890, one legal and administrative, the other military in posture, if not in name. Orders moved first. At Standing Rock, the Indian agent approved an arrest plan for Sitting Bull to be carried out by the agency police at dawn. The stated scope was limited: bring him in for questioning, avoid bloodshed, restore calm around the agency. The police detail assembled in the dark and rode through powder snow toward the cabins along the Grand River. Inside the household, word of the attempt had arrived in fragments. Relatives and supporters gathered. When the police entered, confusion and struggle followed yard to yard again. Shots were fired at close range. Sitting Bull fell, and with him, men from both sides. The legal path had used a local instrument for a local action. The result, irreversible, broke the balance at once. Families who had weighed staying near the agency now turned south through the cold toward Cheyenne River and Pine Ridge. The Telegraph carried official phrasing that morning. Riders carried grief by afternoon. The Pine Ridge line took shape at the same time. The new agent, increasingly alarmed by large circles outside his perimeter, signaled for military support. Department staff sent orders to nearby posts to concentrate companies within reach of the reservation lines. By mid-December, detachments of cavalry and infantry arrived by rail to division posts east of the Missouri, and then marched with wagon trains across frozen section roads to positions near the agency. The order of battle on paper was straightforward: several companies of the 7th Cavalry, elements of other regiments as required, and a detachment with light mountain guns. The command intent was to support civil authority to deter large gatherings near the agency, to arrest named leaders if directed, and to disarm camps judged dangerous. The rules in the field were terse and practical: show strength, avoid surprise, separate families from arms, when possible report by wire at each step. The march itself was a winter problem. From railhead to camp, the column moved through open country where wind cut across the flats and piled drifts in the road cuts. Wagons carried rations at fixed daily issue for soldiers and animals. Haystacks along the route were counted like ammunition. Forage was scarce, and wheels were chained for traction. Guides from the agency directed the column to ground where wood and water could be found, and where a show of force would be seen from the ridges that watched the agency road. On the far side of this movement, Oglala and Brule camps adjusted routes to the cover of draws and the shelter of cottonwoods. Families measured distance not in miles, but in how far elders and children could ride between noon and dusk. The first contacts were not battles. Patrols intercepted small groups on the roads and conducted searches for weapons, sometimes returning men to the agency under guard, sometimes releasing them after a warning. At night, dance circles rose farther from the agency and tightened their perimeter. South and west of Pine Ridge camps gathered near Stronghold Table, where the Badlands formed a natural barrier. Negotiations ran on two tracks. Interpreters told families that presence near the agency would be read as compliance. Agents told superiors that the numbers in the circles were proof of growing defiance. Each assurance thinned against the wind. On the policy track, the department's language hardened after the Standing Rock arrest ended in death. Internal messages urged firm action to prevent the spread of the movement and to capture named teachers who were said to be inflaming the situation. Public statements emphasized restoration of order. The contradiction was not unusual in that era. It did matter in the field. Officers arriving at Pine Ridge read both sets of words and prepared for both outcomes: negotiation if it held force, if it did not. A short order shows the tone that month: bring in the principal agitators if they can be safely taken. Use the agency police if practicable. Avoid firing unless fired upon. Report each arrest by wire. Department Staff Officer, Field Order, Division Headquarters, 18-9-12-10. Through the third week of December, a Maine mini-Conjow camp under Spotted Elk moved south from the Cheyenne River country, seeking safety with kin nearer Pine Ridge. Spotted Elk was ill. The column included many women and children, a few rifles, household goods on sleds and travois, and a white flag to signal intent. Scouting parties for the Army found the trail near Porcupine Creek after Christmas. The intercept that followed it was orderly at first. Soldiers surrounded the camp, accepted the white flag, and escorted the group toward a flat along Wounded Knee Creek, where the ground offered waterwood at a distance and clear fields of fire. A ring of soldiers formed outside the camp. Light guns were placed on nearby rises. Night fell in deep cold. Both sides waited for morning. At dawn, the disarmament began. Interpreters moved through the camp asking for rifles and knives. Wagons stood ready to receive surrendered weapons. Army officers weighed time against risk. A search in winter clothing is slow. A search under watchful eyes is slower. The ring of soldiers tightened. Tension rose as men stood between family lodges and the search parties. In the crush, a rifle discharged. The noise in the still air collapsed spacing and patience at once. Firing erupted from multiple points. Soldiers at the ring shot inward. Men inside the camp tried to return fire and fell. Women and children ran for the ravines. The light guns opened. The fight, such as it was, ended quickly in broken lines and snow-stained dark. After action, the numbers are never final. Army returns listed scores of Lakota dead and wounded, and reported losses among the soldiers measured in the dozens. Lakota accounts named relatives, especially children and elders, and marked the ground as a place of mourning. The range given by later historians for Lakota, dead, runs from the middle hundreds upward, with soldiers dead around 24 and many more wounded. What is certain is that non-combatants bore the greatest share of the loss, and that the camp had arrived under a flag of truce. Immediate humanitarian work fell to agency staff, church workers, and soldiers detailed to carry wounded to Pine Ridge and to bury the dead along the creek. The cold preserved as well as it punished. The work took days. An officer's brief report tried to reduce the chaos to lines and dates, escorted the band of spotted elk to the creek, began disarmament at first light. An accidental discharge precipitated a general firing which I could not at once control. Casualties heavy among the Indians, including women and children. Regimental officer after action report. Near Wounded Knee Creek, T-90-12-29. Logistics shaped the ending. Rations for troops were finite, and winter roads punished wagons. Medical supplies at the agency infirmary were measured in bottles and bandages rather than in wards. Civilians and mission workers improvised cots and heating. Burial details dug through frost where they could. The command redistributed companies to cover roads in and out of the agency and to project calm in the presence of fear. In practice, presence often read as domination to families who had lost loved ones the day before. Negotiation beats followed. Some small camps came in under escort for surrender of arms and names. Others scattered into the Badlands to wait out the season. On paper, the legal path resumed its pace. Committees and inspectors noted dates, ordered inquiries, and compiled testimony. Reports to Washington framed the episode as the tragic result of necessary measures. Parallel to this, letters and petitions from church workers and some officers described the event as a preventable catastrophe. Both sets of documents entered the same file boxes. Their conclusions diverged, but their dates align. Fact and folklore must be kept distinct. Some later stories claim that ghost shirts were universally believed to stop bullets and that men advanced under that belief into gunfire. The record shows variety in teaching and practice across camps and teachers, with the doctrine of nonviolence central, and with many families understanding the shirts as sacred garments rather than armor. Another claim holds that the camp at the creek was a combatant force. The composition of the column led by Spotted Elk shows mostly non-combatants moving under a flag of truce in winter. Where recollections disagree on detail, the ground truth remains the same. A disarmament under guard became an uncontrolled killing in minutes. By early January, the convergence of the two lines was complete. The legal path produced memoranda and internal admonitions to review arrest protocols and the use of agency police in high-risk actions. The military path ended with companies still encamped near Pine Ridge patrols on the roads and a community in shock. The season had carried the ghost dance from ceremony to confrontation, not because its doctrine changed, but because administration chose arrests and disarmament under winter conditions and armed encirclement. The order of battle that month is a list of units. The order of pain is a list of families. The campaign closed without a formal battle, and with casualties heavier than many battles of the decade. The confrontation solved nothing in policy terms. It did decide how the winter of 1890 would be remembered. The turning point came at first light on 1890-12-29 at a bend of Wounded Knee Creek. Who stood at the center was not a war party, but a sick Miniconjo headman Spotted Elk surrounded by families who had come south under a white flag. Where they stood was a flat with shallow cover and frozen ground. When the search for weapons began, the objective on one side was administrative control through disarmament and arrests. On the other, the objective was survival under guard until safe passage could be arranged to Pine Ridge. Both sides faced hard constraints. Ammunition in the Lakota camp was scarce and dispersed with household goods. Rations were low after weeks of short issue. Army orders emphasized support to civil authority and disarmament without general firing. The weather imposed urgency and error. Breath smoked in the air. Numb hands fumbled with straps and blankets. Space collapsed in seconds. The immediate effect was a violent initiative shift determined by position and numbers. A single discharge at close quarters triggered fire from the encircling line. The ring of soldiers held the ground and poured inward fire. Inside the ring, men tried to cover lodges and elders. Women ran with children toward the ravines. Within minutes, the maneuvering space for those inside disappeared. What followed was not a stand with reserves or a breakout with mounted rear guards, but a rout under artillery and rifle fire in winter. When the shooting ended, the Army held the field and the initiative. The Lakota survivors were gathered and taken toward Pine Ridge under escort. The surrender that followed in other small camps was not negotiated from strength, but compelled by cold shock and the knowledge of what had happened at the creek. An admission against interest survives in the tone of internal reviews that winter and early spring, even when phrased to defend policy. One line, clipped and careful, reaches beyond defense. We brought too many rifles too close to too many hungry people in too small a place. ISUS Department Inspector Memorandum, Division of the Missouri, 1891-0112. The human cost is measured in names and paths. Spotted Elk did not leave the field. His people were counted on lists drawn up at Pine Ridge infirmaries and mission houses in the days after women and children prominent among the wounded. Survivors like Dewey Beard, later known in English records, carried scars and a record of kin lost. Winter counts from Oglala record keepers marked the year with an image of soldiers and a creek. The displacement path traced by those who lived ran from the snow at Wounded Knee to cots under mission roofs, then to agency ration lines, then back to camps reassembled with fewer voices. Graves were cut into frozen soil where digging was possible and stacked where it was not a compromise with season and sorrow. Two lines of counterfactual are narrow and grounded in the record. If civilian and military leaders had accepted a slower, purely civilian process built around emergency rations and distance rather than encirclement and search. At dawn, the likelihood of lethal panic decreases. If commanders had ordered the outer ring to remain at greater interval and withheld artillery while interpreters worked family by family, a discharge inside the camp would have been less likely to cascade into general fire. These alternatives do not erase tension or remove risk. They do show that the fatal hinge was administrative design under winter conditions, not an inevitable clash of armies. What the hinge reveals loops back to the structure set in P2. The Sioux Act of 1889 defeated land and thinned rations. Drought and crop failure bent households toward dependency that the 1890 appropriations could not relieve. The policy shift from war to interior replaced campaigns with rules and police, but with fewer tools for mercy when fear rose. Schools took children and time. Allotment took room to maneuver. Into this architecture, the ghost dance placed discipline, hope, and a communal rhythm that could be taught in an afternoon and held through the night. Officials read numbers in a circle as numbers in a column. Telegraph lines amplified alarm faster than wagons could carry reassurance. The turning point at Wounded Knee Creek was therefore not an isolated spark. It was the place where a year of ration cuts, drought reports, arrest plans, and encirclement orders met a winter camp led by a sick headman carrying a white flag. That is why the day still fixes the memory of the whole season. January 1891 opened on paper before it opened on the ground. At Pine Ridge, the Office of Indian Affairs recorded lists of the wounded, moved into agency buildings, and the Holy Cross mission rooms that had been turned into a hospital cots arranged beneath leftover holiday garlands. Clergy and agency staff wrote brief notes on supplies and names. Army details carried the worst cases in from the snow. In Washington, the Interior and War Departments exchanged memoranda on the line between civil authority and military support. Investigations began framed as inquiries into arrests, disarmament protocols, and command judgment in winter. Law moved through familiar channels. The Secretary of War received endorsements and reports through January and February 1891, including the views of field commanders whose language mixed defense of subordinates with recognition of a calamity that no order could sanitize. The record shows the pace of inquiry by date and the range of opinion within the department. Some urged that the soldiers had acted under sudden threat. Others, including senior leaders, argued for changes to arrest procedures and to the use of agency police in high-risk actions. The paper trail preserved the admission that protocol under winter encirclement had helped produce tragedy. Administration at the agencies did not pause. Reservation boundaries defined by the 1889 Sioux Agreement still govern jurisdiction. the same statute that had divided the Great Sioux Reservation into Pine Ridge, Rosebud, Cheyenne River, and Standing Rock now shaped where relief could be issued and where patrols could lawfully ride. The language of the act reads like a surveyor's path, rivers, meridians, and parallels converted into daily rules for annuities and rations. Under those rules, reduced beef contracts and flour allotments continued through the winter and spring. By midwinter, transfers and arrests tapered. The agency police resumed routine duties under closer supervision, and small camps drifted back toward their usual locations as weather allowed. The Army redistributed companies and prepared to withdraw to posts, leaving a residue of inquiries and a community's altered demography. Census tables in the annual reports recorded changes without names, the columns showing fewer people in some districts and more dependents in mission care. The same volumes reviewed allotment progress and school headcounts, presenting the year as an administrative sequence rather than a season of loss. Policy did not change course. The Dawes Act still stood behind allotment and the push for private land titles. Interior memoranda that winter used the language of citizenship and agriculture, while critics inside and outside government warned that parceling land under compulsion and opening so-called surplus to settlers would deepen poverty. In effect, the aftermath was administered inside the very framework that had contributed to the surge of ceremony the year before. Land and resource pressures resumed their long trajectory. Grazing leases expanded as survey crews returned to the field in spring. Rail spurs and freight contracts aligned with the post's supply needs and the agency's movement of goods. Mining elsewhere in the region continued to draw capital and labor, while on the reservations families tried to balance small plots under allotment with seasonal wage work. The Sioux Agreement's financial provisions and the so-called benefit funds purchased implements and built some agency structures, but they could not replace the economy that had been broken. Health and demography in 1891 followed predictable winter lines made worse by stress. Exposure and infection has turned treatable wounds into funerals. Births dipped and deaths rose among children and elders. Contemporary diaries from settlers near the reservation line and letters from agency physicians captured the same details in different voices. Storm days, improvised transport, and the slow improvement that came only when spring opened the roads. Cultural continuance did not end. Public ghost dance gatherings became rare near agency grounds under watchful regulation, but the songs and teachings persisted in quieter places. Scholars who tracked the ceremony across the next decade found it continuing on other reservations in the West, and they argued that what had been attacked as a threat was in practice a philosophy of patience and renewal adapted to crushing policy pressures. The massacre and the ceremony were linked in memory, but not identical as events or meanings. Language and ceremony adapted to policy limits. Children were still sent to schools where English instruction and uniforms set the daily rhythm, yet families preserved Lakota in homes and camps and later reorganized teaching through colleges and local programs. At Standing Rock, a project built around elders' voices produced new language resources for learners. At Sitting Bull College, a capacity-building initiative focused on adult fluency and teaching skills. Federal programs now direct grants toward immersion and revitalization, and a national plan frames restitution in language policy terms. These efforts mark continuance in another register, a community response that uses the tools of the present to repair damage done by the policies of the past. Memory work was immediate and enduring. Winter counts recorded the year with images of soldiers and a creek, ledger drawings, and later testimonies named kin and places. In mission rooms at Pine Ridge, photographs show the makeshift hospital where survivors recovered the decorations, still hanging into the new year. Later histories debated numbers and motives, but local commemorations held a different center. Prayers at graves, family stories kept through the decades, and community events that returned to the site with an insistence that names be spoken. Present day, governments carry that memory into policy. The Oglala Lakota government at Pine Ridge, the Cheyenne River community that includes the Miniconjou, the Standing Rock Lakota and Dakota, and the Sikongu at Rosebud, all operate programs that assert sovereignty, sustain culture, and broaden opportunity within reservation boundaries first drawn by statute. Standing Rock's public statements emphasize language, culture, and well-being as core commitments. Pine Ridge institutions support revitalization through schools, media, and partnerships. The continuity lies not in an unbroken practice of 19th century life, but in a resilient adaptation that holds identity through law and time. The documentary record also preserves the disputes that followed. Official returns long gave narrow casualty totals, while Lakota accounts and later scholarship set the number of dead far higher and placed non-combatants at the center of the losses. That gap is visible in encyclopedias and in public media histories that synthesize scholarship and family memory. It also appears in the archival series lists that guide researchers through boxes of reports and testimonies at the National Archives. The multiplicity of sources is not a weakness. It is the condition of responsible history after trauma. By the close of 1891, the federal file boxes on the Winter were full. The law had completed its paperwork. Boundaries remained as drawn. Allotment and school regimes continued. Leases rails and access rules pressed on. Yet the people whose Winter had been recorded in casualty lists and rations logs persisted in ceremony language and governance. That persistence is the continuance this part of the story must mark. It is also the frame for the final assessment. The ghost dance surge ended in state violence, but the nations who danced did not end. They live where the statutes said they would live, and where their own laws and languages say they will continue to live. Across a long arc of policy and memory, three conclusions hold. First, the ghost dance among the Lakota in 1890 was a religious movement of renewal, not an organized war plan. Its doctrine taught moral discipline and patience, and its rapid spread reflected structural pressures already in place. Ration reductions under new statutes, drought and crop failure, and stricter agency rules rather than a sudden turn to violence. Second, the decisive escalation came when civilian fear translated into arrest orders and armed encirclement under winter conditions. Administrative design, not battlefield initiative, set the terms of the confrontation. Third, the killing at Wounded Knee Creek was a mass casualty event whose victims were largely non-combatants, and it reshaped federal Indian policy debates and Native community life well into the new century. Important points remain contested. Casualty totals differ across official returns, later inquiries and family testimony. The range for Lakota dead spans the middle hundreds, with soldiers' losses far lower, and scholars continue to refine estimates against incomplete lists and winter burials. The role of individual figures is argued in detail, whether specific teachers urged defiance, whether some officers lost control or never had it, and how much agency police could or should have done inside a plan they did not write. The meaning of the shirts worn by some dancers is a recurrent dispute. Careful reading shows variation across teachers and camps, with many understanding them as sacred garments rather than armor. These disagreements do not erase the central pattern. They mark the limits of any record made in shock and snow. The legacy branches in three directions. As doctrine, the ghost dance endures in memory, as a philosophy of repair under pressure, a way to hold community when law and hunger narrowed choices. As reform, the aftermath fed arguments over arrest protocols, the use of agency police, and the terms of allotment and school regimes, though change often came slow and partial. As symbol, Wounded Knee Creek became a place name for state violence and for persistence. Later generations returned there in ceremony and protest, anchoring claims to sovereignty and to narrative control. Placed within the century's wider history, the surge of 1890 is a hinge between treaty promises and allotment realities, between military campaigns and administrative rule, between a ceremony of hope and an apparatus of fear. It shows how a religious movement can be read as rebellion when policy has left no margin for trust, and how a single winter can compress decades of pressure into one day that fixes the story for those who lived and those who would remember. The event endures in memory because it binds dates and policies to families and songs, making clear how decisions on paper can break or preserve a people in the space of a cold morning. Today's story closes on two currents: community memory and government paperwork. Where does the more enduring legacy live, in policy reform or in the songs and language that survived? Comment policy or memory and your reason. Thanks for watching.